Chapter 7, The Subsurface World. The fall, however imperfectly aftershadowed by the ancient myths, was in truth the fall of womanhood. The entire being truly and purely human, that is to say, uniting by an inter-involved and fluid constitution the capacity of response to the dual influxes from divinity, could only depart from this full capacity of response by the first failure of its feminine side, for the feminine is within the masculine, and within the feminine resides the forms which the seeds of life from the immense divinity take on for terrestrial development. The woman of the perfect race remains the open door by which divineness passes to the man, as the central vigors of the frame to its wide circumference. The faculty still consciously possessed by brooding tenderness or passionate affection of penetrating and residing in the very spirit of the object that is loved, belongs in right to the whole person of the creature who grew forth from the elements of the divine Creator, and who, as to his most external framework, his last overlay of shape, should be properly a spirit still, and in no wise deprived of those attributes which overcome resistances termed space and time, of which men even in their present grossness are still possessed in regards the activity of emotions and intellect. That last overlay of the man assumes the form in our present terrestrial conditions, to which we give the name of body. But this coarse and heavy husking of each organic particle of the true man's frame, which that true frame rejects and forces to die at a given period of its own internal growth, is a system of machinery far more abnormal and foreign to the God-made man than terrestrial manhood has till now been capable of understanding. It is only as the period arrives during which the dissolution throughout terrestrial manhood of this excessive layer will be slow and orderly processes be gradually effected, that his spiritual intellectual perceptions acquire a new acumen by which the truth, essential now to all his progress, can be received and verified by him. In the true order, then, of original nature to which man must in the end return, the human creature is as unhampered in its inherent faculty of interpenetrating with its atoms the free spaces of each member of its kind, that is to say, forms mingle and dissever as with the property we may call fluid or ethereal, as if he were without any exterior corporeal covering. Nevertheless, so long as his service to the divine behest retains him in any given world, the ultimate efflorescence which his God-human form pushes forth upon him assimilates so much of the finer particles in the atmospheres of that earth as is required to establish between him and the surrounding domain of his due activities in organic connection. Thus, in all pure worlds, the outer body is to this extent earthly. It is as the delicate skin to the inner and finer body forms of the man's other degrees, laid round the particles of these, that a medium may exist by which the radiating life currents, propelled from all their centers, may establish immediate contact with the elements of the surrounding world. For where there has been no marring of nature's functional order, the will radiations from the human being impose their motions upon every form of animal, vegetable, and inorganic life around him, and he is not the victim of forces which he should control. Nevertheless, this ultimate body is not properly like our bodies, a coarse and opaque accretion, put on as protection against mischievous invasion through brute life, but is, in spite of its assimilation to the sphere which it resides, deprived of none of those qualities which are essentially inherent to all pure human forms. Thus, the faculty of the two halves of one human being, male and female, of indwelling in the yielding forms of one another, only differs in the nature of its peculiar degree from the power exercised in true conditions by every human organism of flowing through another's spaces. Nevertheless, the union in the atoms of the dual being, the complement in complement, has another and a deeper basis than this mere faculty of interpenetration, which is the natural possession of all purely human creatures. No severance between the male and the female essence forms, in their deep interior manifestation, could ever be effected, and that superficial severance which these shapes of the actual bodies of this earth present makes it difficult for our external mind, habituated to such half-forms, to entertain even the idea of that inseparability and mutual indwelling of the dual body of the uninjured man. He is not only an individual, male and female, whose aerial composition permits even his whole form to melt into forms of others of his kind, in accordance with the laws and requirements of his love and service, but the intermelting of each fragment of himself within himself is a fixed and indissoluble fact, so that no particle of any of his many form coverings is male alone or female alone, but is both. For the humanness of these particles, that is to say, their power of response to the divine vital currents in their duality, consists in this biunity of constitution. Even in the conditions in which men live upon the globe, with hard crusts coating each tender organism of their molecules, the fluent properties of their inner ardent beings are not so deeply hidden nor so paralyzed as many would imagine. And close under each contracting surface of the man or woman, lonely in this harsh external degree, lie the folded cells that represent the completeness of his or her biunity, and which await only such circumstances as shall release them from the arrest of their proper evolution, in order to expand by the thrill of inner vitality in a manner that shall leave neither man nor woman in any doubt, whether there stirs throughout the awakening spaces of the frame the presence of another self. It is in the inconceivable closeness of the real interior union of the biune creature, the true man, in the severance at a remote period of human history upon this planet of the external form into appearances exclusively male or female, when the sex separateness of lower forms of being become the inheritance of the external man. In the secret stirring within the depths even of this lopsided humanness, of the sense of its still more hidden sanctity of dual life, in the confusing vehemence of the action upon the outer layers of the frame, of the sex currents impressing them from the mixed life of the surrounding earth, in the long ignorance that has necessarily prevailed among the earth's sons and daughters of this union and this conflict in themselves between their true sex nature and their false, that has lain till now the mystery of human loves. It matters not to us either when or how, or in what individuals or races of this earth's humanity, the change from the trueness of man's dual nature to the falseness of a nature surfacely admixed with base ingredients was effected. But it matters for such men and women as would take up at this most vital juncture of the world's reconstructive history their fragments of the work of readmitting this humanity into conditions that are real and true, to be clearly impregnated with such views as will be found totally with and explain the deepening experiences into which their efforts must inevitably plunge them. And of these, the central one which throws its light upon the disasters of Earth's story is the self-banishment of the woman part of man from her own plane and function. Her defection of old was in truth the beginning of sorrows, as her abnormal position remains to this day the pivot of the world's distress. The center force of physical and spiritual life, sex love, tears, the whole mass of the globe's habitants, as with the destiny of unrest, destroys while it creates, burns while it enlightens, and bestializes while it transfigures. And the fall of the woman was, and is, the key to the enigma of love. Her default is the alpha and the omega of pain. The tendency observable in many ancient myths, which offer descriptions of the opening of evil into the world, to throw on the feminine being the whole blame of the catastrophe, arose, doubtless, from some survived perception of the fact that, unless the inner woman form of the true dual creature had permitted the penetration toward the sanctuary of her organism by currents whose activity was disorderly, the pollution of the complete biune personality could not have been effected. The woman form being within, and being the wellspring and repository of all the divine currents destined for the radiative vitalization of the whole duality of forms, there could be no arrest, however partial, of the normal outflow from her as the center to the male complementary coverings as circumference, unless she from her sanctum permitted a life current to vibrate from without inwards upon some fibers of her constitution. For the strength of the divine radiation established by the woman and projected into external life by the man would resist any invasive force which might seek to propel itself against the dual potency. The question of how it happened that any forces were already abroad in the universe, impelling themselves through its substances in modes and directions partially subversive of the radiative laws of currents prior to their introduction into the organisms of the inhabitants of this earth, is one which is not useful in the present connection to discuss, for it is not pertinent to the moral interests of man in the present day to hold in consideration before his mind any more of the disorder among the planets than that which he has to deal. A clear retrospect of the manner in which disturbing life vibrations have acted upon the whole organic body of his kind, since the misadventure of their first attack upon it until today, is a distinctly practical necessity for him. The labor of the future, and whose threshold he now stands, is to undo by natural processes and efforts all that has been left accomplished in the humanity of his earth of what he calls evil. The results of it are to be extinguished, the deposits of its activity to be dissolved down to the very earliest. The lesions made in the infant organism of the young earth race must find at least their cure. Thus it imports to look back to the beginnings, for its traces are written upon each organism at this day, and are its inheritance and the sign of its brotherhood with the men of all the times. In regards that anterior question towards which imagination, in its pursuit of causes, can scarcely fail to strain, the clearness and strength of vision into the veiled regions of the universe which develops with the other redeveloping faculties that properly appertain to human beings, will enable each one in his time to understand the facts. It is to protect him from difficulties which would supervene upon his contemplation of the errors which lie outside his world, that a premature enlightenment of spirit in regard to them is deeply to be deprecated. The wisdom of his fuller stature will in future times enable him to handle many subjects of which the nature and the potencies would now only fruitlessly unbalance his mental and spiritual equilibrium. The beginning, which the strong vitalization now reigning from the regions of high beings upon our beast must retrieve, was the beginning of the reception into terrestrial humanity of forces of disorder. They struck among the inner foldings of the young bisexual being at the feminine degree of its two-in-one organization. They invaded the surfaces of the then most tender child womanhood hidden within the masculine, making a vibration along her channels for radiative force from without inwards against the currents which she was constructed to impel only from her centers outward, and through the man out forth into the world around. Thus this maid and mother form, pattern in the limit of its destined neighbors after the inward sanctity of the feminine in God, the central vessel is the human for secret inception of all vitalities from the divine, and for their distribution outwards into the masculine, became, at least in some layers of its superficial region, the seat of a disorderly, because centerwards directed force, and of an agitation due to the collision of this with the orderly radiations from within. With the change which was then established, described in the opening chapter, by which a protective and defensive accretion of coarse elements was added upon the surface forms of the human creature, becoming the basis which developed ultimately into the bodies of our present species, the injured woman's services, as well as those of the man, had to be covered. Thus she was separated from the man by the necessities of the solid nature of this new flesh, and in the surface layer of personality, the human creature, which could not lose the fashion, even in its degradation, of the all-holy prototype, adopted the manner of the inferior world, insofar as its male and female constituent parts became two. The secret woman came forth to breast the world, and the forces at large in it, like another sort of man, deprived in her region of the outer frame of the quality in her original fluidity, by which at will she withdrew herself within the protection of the male envelopings, and deprived of the screen which was to be held up between the delicate processes of her activities and the rough forces at work in external nature, so the reproduction of the coarse flesh form followed, after the fashion of the lower creation, and resulted in males and females, and not in the biune man. While into the attractions indicating the laws of such reproduction, there entered that quality of unrest to which allusion has been made as consequent upon the shock of conflict throughout the nerve system between the sex currents from the animal creation and the divine creative flow. A population of a mixed nature began in this manner to hold its uncertain sway in the planet Earth, a human-animal race with an outer organization which has never since been in the field for a conflict of currents upon which, aeon after aeon, there has been repeated in each separate individual the strife of the divine evolution with the invasion from the unhuman forces of lower nature. From the time of this arrest in the orderly progress of the dual humanity, the weak and abortive man descended from his throne of empire over all that, in his world, which was not man. The kingdoms of the beast, the plant, the mineral, of the winds and of the finer elements had lost with his failure the medium of direct transmission to them of the divine outgoing, and all became in their manner regions for the conflict of confused and undirected forces. The human crown of the orb's creation, having lost its original capacity for holding the full charge of biune vigors, ceased to dispense a dominating and controlling radiation of currents throughout the inferior creation. As we have seen, the portion of that creation which stood nearest to it in the wonders of its organization, the animal, had become to some extent successfully hostile, and had begun to impel backwards upon man vibrations from its vitality, whereas, according to the order of true nature, it would only have received from him its appropriate and perfecting degree from the fountains of life. The attenuation of those broken rays of vitality, which continued to feed the regions of brute development, now ran riot, and generated from their confusion those positive qualities of ferocity, rapacity, cruelty, jealousy, stupidity, filth, and scortation, whose foul fumes then began to percolate in fine spaces of human beings. And the frail race of the divine image retained the services of a fragment only of the lower creatures of its kingdom. But while the irresponsible animal world became in this manner a source of distress and inverse pressure to man, by virtue of the fact that the organism of the latter had covered itself with a layer of particles derived from that animal world, and had entered upon a cycle of existence during which, for reasons already described, he could only subsist with safety amidst external nature by thus enveloping himself, the propulsion of these animal qualities towards the human being originated not among these poor creatures, ungifted with moral will, but in regions pervading the finer spaces of all terrestrial life, the subsurface spaces in the man, the animal, and the plant, in fact, in all organic or inorganic matter. The subtle region is one to which man's consciousness has had a fluctuating axis since the change which propelled that consciousness during terrestrial life outwards upon a still more external degree of gross organization. It is the region of this many-layered existence in which his true evolution was arrested, the degree originally his ultimate or external one, the residence once of his surface consciousness, the true plane from which he was to act upon the world around him, the circumference from which he was to dart forth the radiation of divine vigors after their constructive passage through his infold forms from their deep centers, the degree, in fact, his appearance, in which being his outward appearance, fitted for life upon the earth, was his true earthly body. During all subsequent ages since this failure of the unperfected man to evolve in the manner exclusively human, since this early stage when man, amid his many degrees of consciousness, possessed, as the most external one, his sense of residence in that pure pliant body which originally appropriated him to the requirements of his earthly life, there have been intervals in the history of individuals and of races when the consciousness of existence in this sense-overlaid region of the organism has returned. When in due time the animal accretion had set fast its growth upon the human race, and in lapse of generations that which we now know as human flesh had matured upon the separated sexes to its distorted likeness of divine human form, the consciousness of man became, for the most part, limited to this new outer region of his life, and was closed, though always with exceptions, during his presence on this globe, to the multiple degrees, one within another, of his interior experiences. He knew himself thenceforth chiefly as a creature weighted by insurmountable attractions to the matter of the earthly ball, and made obedient by an instinct of body preservation to the same laws which reigned in surrounding matter. His consciousness had, in fact, become almost, though never entirely, limited to the plane of his superficial crust. But during the earliest period before the solidification of the new growth upon the human organism, the earth humanity dwell in open, though in gradually darkening consciousness, in the region which had been a surface one, and in which communication is uninterrupted, owing to the fluid nature of all forms between one creature and another, as between the organizations of the different classes of creation. Man saw himself present at will by interpenetration of particles in the organisms of others, or in any of the forms of external nature. He knew himself in the connected subsurface world with the perceptive and sensational knowledge that has long since, with the vast majority of people, become entirely extinct. But in this subsurface world, the field for the proper, though never perfectly developed, externalization of all earthly atomic structures, human or otherwise, there occurred from the date of man's first misfortune the superposition on this organisms of an abnormal extra-externalization, abnormal in the case of the divinely imaged beings, because in the abrogation of their positive attitude towards lower nature, particles from this flew towards them for the construction of their new flesh, abnormal in the case of the rest of nature, which should have remained negative to the outflowing influence of man, and should have received from him, never imparted to him, currents of constructive force. For this lower nature now put on in process of its growth new outer services, the building up of which had to be accomplished in imperfection for lack of that arrested current into all the kingdoms of his subject surroundings, which the true man would have diffused out of the concentration in himself of the fullnesses of divine vitality. It was because of this abnormal ultimatization of organisms in this subsurface world, the plane of life upon which all beings met and held intercourse from whatever other world or condition they approached, provided they possessed the corresponding degree of organic ultimatization, that the early peoples of the age under consideration, moving, acting, and perceiving consciously in the subsurface world, were in a position which exposed them to the known access not only of ministrant beings having the required degree of form, so that they could approach them from many distant regions, but also, by virtue of the same laws, to troubled and troublesome beings, who either rolled in upon this plane from without, or found themselves hovering helplessly upon it in the spaces immediately enveloping this earth. In the latter case, they were those among the poor earth children who, having disappeared by death out of its new external plane and sloughed off the mere accretion, had not yet evolved in their true and persistent personality to that point when they could be removed to happier distances and higher possibilities of growth. As we have said, even since the date when the accreted fleshly form of the type possessed by us had become fully organized, a date certainly far anterior to the actual transcription of any historical tradition, though not anterior to all the facts imperfectly recorded by the remotest tradition, there has been a fluctuating projection of consciousness into the subsurface world, and when the facts just now alluded to are held in mind, the facts of the activity upon that plane in beings and in things both of imperfectly disembodied people from this world and of foreign ones of an obnoxious character, it will be found how simple is the explanation of ancient and modern phenomena deemed occult, spiritualistic, and marvelous, while a vast number of the unexplained facts of life, not obviously connected with this truth, nevertheless depend upon it. The fact, of all perhaps the least suspected by the majority of thinkers, the fact of the constant drift upon man's nature of particles from animal life, stands in close connection with this condition of the subsurface world, which has had here to be described in order that the nature of this suffering of the human being may be clearly understood. Those spirits, and the term, though improper and misleading, has to be used in the absence consequent upon general ignorance of any name for beings whose bodies are of the subsurface degree, who cannot rise into the atmospheres required for the attainment of fuller evolution, are in constant need of the substances of the external nature from which they have disappeared. Thus the sojourners in subsurface earth conditions prey ceaselessly, as long as they remain in them, upon the elements of men. But although man consciously or unconsciously exists in his subsurface degree in open contact with the whole universe of subsurface existence, running throughout organized and inorganic earthly creation, the current of his deeper nature streaming forth into this region makes ceaseless war in it with all the spiritual forces that attack him. At these portals of his deep within, spirits may annoy or fiends may torture, but they cannot possess this degree of his personality because of the flames from the sword of the angel who guards the treasure of his divine identity below. Therefore, the unhappy, disembodied creatures who, from the dissatisfaction and distress of their life in this subsurface or spiritual region, cannot fail to crave for man's more potently human elements, are obliged to attack him in his still more outward degree. The inherited body of the animal accretion, this body, by virtue of the elements that it has in common with those of the brute creation, is open to the invasion and possession by any fluid organisms that may invade or possess the irresponsible brute, and the impotence of the man of this earth to rule and direct by projection of radiations in the animal world has left that world exposed to free access and possession from the disorderly spiritual inhabitants of subsurface life. These enter the animal and, for the matter of that, the lower sub-kingdoms of nature in the subsurface degree, and work unhindered outward among the particles of the external form, feeding upon the finer elements of the external. Thus fortified and externalized, they can approach the external man, and draw to themselves the elements of his external organization, entering into its very spaces, and to this extent possessing the man. Thus entrenched, they can indeed attack him from his own outworks, in his subsurface or spiritual degree, and may even penetrate more or less towards its interiors. But however far or devastating their advance may have been, the watch is eternally set that bars their absolute possession of the subsurface man, where the portals of his divine life essences discharge their streams of purest fire. This is how man is born to his griefs and his limitations, to his subjection to the forces of external nature, to his strife with those within. This is the condition which is gradually to be annihilated. It is the scaffolding which has concealed for unknown numbers of human centuries the slow growth of the untainted personality of the collective human creature which now is bursting forth. The axe is now laid at the base of the useless and rotten outer structure, and the cycle which begins will dissolve its crumbling elements till they disappear.